Gettysburg Address is a really great speech. It's very short, and yet when you're inside the paragraph, it seems cavernous. He's talking as if he has all the time in the world, and he's doing this in 3 paragraphs.
Welcome to Classical Etc. You're in the studio with Memoria Press.
Hello, and welcome to another episode of Classical Etc. I'm Jessica Gardner, and I am joined today by Paul Schaefer and Martin Cothran. Gentlemen, glad you're here. Martin, you've been on the road. Glad to have you back.
I have been on the road. I've been a traveling man.
Yeah. And Paul?
If I trusted my singing voice, I would have sung On the Road again, but I don't
And then
really.
I would have been very sorry that I had said that.
Oh, speaking of things you've said. Today,
That's a great start. That's scary.
What a segue. Today we are discussing our classical rhetoric set written by our very own Martin. So will it be a toast or a roast? We'll see.
It's a good question.
Oh, but before we get to that, how is your summer reading going?
Slow.
Really?
Slow. I
Yeah.
mean, I'm still working through The Hounds of God by Sabatini, which is fun, but it's fun enough to keep me like in a crazy summer willing to pick it up and read a couple chapters at night slowly. Like the one night a week I have time to do so.
And how long is it? I know you talked about it before, but
It's not terribly long. I mean, what do you think? Those 300 pages, maybe? Sabatini or a regular Sabatini book's about that long. Sabatini sometimes comes off as anti-Catholic and sometimes comes off as anti-Protestant. And I think he actually does a pretty good job of being like, what's important is how virtuous the individual is. And which is fascinating. And so there's all this, it's all set in the struggle between Spain and England, the naval struggles. And so it absolutely has my interest, you know.
Well, anyone who can pull off convincing portrayals of virtuous pirates is,
Yes.
That's a trick.
Yes. Well, you know, what really caught me a little off guard, and I mean, it made sense, but like after the Spaniard abducts this English noblewoman because he wants to marry her, it's like, that's a smart move, right? But then the Spanish ship that picks him up, like this other guy, like he had arranged to have the Spanish ship pick him up. And then there's a Dominican friar on the ship because Spain always has to have a spiritual guide on every ship. And the guy who just kidnapped this woman is really irate that there's a priest on the ship, you know? And then the priest gets really irate that this Spanish nobleman wants to marry a heretic. It's just, the whole thing's hysterical. The machinations. He's very inventive and fun to read.
Writer.
good summer read. Yeah. Martin?
Well, I'm reading, my wife and I are rereading Bleak House by Charles Dickens, which is, I think, his most challenging novel because of the length. And we do it on long trips, but no trip is long enough to read Bleak House. So it requires about 5 long trips. And so we're about the 3rd long trip, but we are only halfway still.
Oh my goodness!
Yeah, it's 67 chapters.
Wow.
Yeah,
how many?
Not short.
Do you know how many hours of listening that is?
Oh, I think it's about 30, somewhere close to 40.
Okay,
40 hours. So back in that again, but again, it just reminds me. I just love Dickens' world, and he's got. I just love his. There's always this lurking sense of humor underneath everything that just pops up in different places. I mean, there's serious things going on. There's really sad things that go on, but there's this sense of humor behind it all in the way he views the world. Which, and every time I read him, I'm reminded why Chesterton liked Dickens so much, because it's the same sense of humor.
Well, reading for humor is a really interesting thing. Like, you can't read Chesterton without picking up some of the humor, because you just, he's very paradoxical. Whereas like Dickens, I think you can read it and completely miss the humor.
I don't know.
I think it depends on your temperament, really.
Oh, gosh. If you don't see Dickens, do you don't see humor in Dickens, then problem's not with the book.
I think that's I'm making that point, Martin. Right? Like when you read, you may have somebody who just doesn't find the joy in it at all, and it's literally just they're not seeing it. But I think Dickens, it's subtle enough that you could absolutely miss it if you're not trying to focus on the names that he's using or the
But I mean, the scene with Mr. and Mrs. Smallweed, and they're these two very, very elderly people that can hardly walk, and they're sitting there in their chairs around the fire, and at some point one of the characters comes to visit Mr. and Mrs. Smallweed, and she's kind of out of her mind, and he gets mad at her, and he'll throw pillows at her, and it's just this. My wife was just laughing hysterically at this little scene where just this relationship between these two, Mr. and Mrs. Smallweed, and the not only the number of characters in a book, but the distinctiveness. I mean, they're completely different character types, and there's, every character is somebody who you've met in life. And so there's, and if you read enough Dickens, you would be constantly assessing people on the basis of which Dickens character does this person represent. And, that's Mr. Guppy, and my wife and I find myself doing that there's somebody we meet and it reminds us of some Dickens character. And he's so successful in creating a world. And I just think I really, there may be a better writer than him in English, but I don't think so.
Have you read Little Dorrit?
There's a bunch of them I still haven't read.
Oh,
I still haven't read Little Dorrit and The Old Curiosity Shop. And, there's several that I haven't done. And I'm really looking forward to it. After I get done with Bleak House, when I'm 87 years old.
Martin, I think you and Joyce would like Little Dorrit. It's such a delight.
I think I'd like anything he wrote.
Yeah.
I mean, even what's the first one he wrote, where the guys are just kind of running around England and I forget the name of it, but which is not really, doesn't have much of a plot and everything. It's still fun to read because of the characters.
Yeah.
So
Jess, have you been reading anything this summer?
No.
It's a busy summer for you.
It's a busy summer for me. Yeah. I get married in 2 weeks. So.
All right.
Wow. Yeah. Don't let that stop you.
I was going to say, after that, you're going to have so much time on your hands.
I know. I have a list of books that I'm going to start like this winter. But yeah, nothing lately for me, unfortunately.
Yeah, I know my wife had plenty of time on her hands after she married me.
Martin.
She'd say, "Are you kidding?"
Oh, on to today's topic, classical rhetoric. Paul, I want to start with you. The word rhetoric can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people.
It can mean a lot of things. And but in the world I grew up in, it was always a positive thing, right? I mean, there was an explicit thing when I was in seminary that, right, you're learning rhetoric in order to be able to be persuasive about the word of God, right? But at our conference recently, we had Dr. Hankins here to speak from Harvard, and he made a comment that has just kind of, it's stuck with me and just kind of pinged around in my head for a while about that. He's like, we should use the word eloquence, not the word rhetoric, because most people hear the term rhetoric in the context of empty rhetoric, right? They hear that phrase, and so they just in their minds, they just sort of shorten it to rhetoric, and they're like, well, why would you want to basically teach people to be sophists, right? And so then that, figure, since we're going to have a conversation with Martin, who wrote a guide on rhetoric, we might as well.
So Martin, what does our rhetoric set aim to do? it isn't necessarily a public speaking course. It's not a writing course.
No, I mean, it's basically just a study of Aristotle's book on rhetoric, okay, which was probably the most influential book on oratory, and it's very basic because all he's really doing is, I mean, in a sense, the backbone of the book is the true, the good, and the beautiful. Okay, he's taking the three means of persuasion, which track the true, the good, and the beautiful, ethos, logos, and pathos, and it's an observation that's the way the human soul is structured. That's the structure of the human soul right there. And so he's saying, and he doesn't say it explicitly, but he's assuming it, that if the human soul is structured in this way, then you need to know how to appeal to that structure, right? I mean, it's very, very.
What's the structure?
Well, the structure is the mind, the character of the person, and the person's emotions,
or their affections, like as far as the beauty goes, what they're attracted to,
what they're viscerally attracted to. So he's saying, look, here's how you persuade somebody. You persuade them on the basis of your own character, first of all. People will believe sometimes you'll believe somebody just because of who they are. Their credibility is so high with you that if this person said it, then
it's like when Martin used to recommend books to me. I trust him because he was Martin, and then there were a couple of duds, and I thought, then that just knocked down his credibility. Recommending books to me.
Then I had to purge him out of my people I recommend books to because it clearly didn't.
There's a mutual purging happening.
My credibility was ruining his mind, and his credibility was ruining my mind.
Yeah. So, it's the power of your character. Are you honest? Do you know what you're talking about? Do you know all those kinds of things, right? And then, so that's ethos. Then there's logos. It's the rational force of what you're saying. Is what you're saying logical? Does your conclusion really rationally follow from your assumptions? That sort of thing. I mean, sometimes something is convincing to you because it just makes logical sense, right? And then finally, pathos, which is because ethos is in the speaker, logos is in the speech, and then pathos is in the audience. So in addition to ethos and logos, you need to be able to make your audience want to believe you, to desire to believe you. You're getting at their affections, at their emotions, and you need to enroll their emotions in your case in some way. And so, in Aristotle's book, he goes at great lengths to talk about every emotion and how you excite it, and how you may want somebody to be excited, you may want somebody to be fearful, you may want somebody to be sad, you may want somebody to be happy. And that's going on in your audience, not in you, right? But you're trying to bring it about there. And he talks about ways to do that. So I find that not only instructive in persuading people, but in teaching itself. And when I give talks on teaching, I talk about this, that this is also how to teach, right? As a teacher, teaching is a persuasive situation, a rhetorical situation. You're trying to get your kids to learn. And they may learn from the textbook, logos. They may learn from you as a teacher because they really focus in on you and what you're saying, and that's ethos. But there's also pathos. Are you able to make your students want to learn, right? So I think it has just so many great applications, and that ethos, logos, pathos paradigm is so rich in the way you can apply it. But so really Aristotle's book is the theory of rhetoric, right?
Because Aristotle is a theorist.
That's right. And he's not telling you how to write a persuasive paper. Okay.
Right. Or put together a speech.
Right. That's right. And so what I did in my rhetoric book is at the very end, I actually have Cicero's 6-part speech, persuasive speech, which is, I did public policy for many years, and I was a policy person at the state level here in Kentucky. and did a lot of like 1-page papers on issue papers on particular pieces of legislation, on whatever it was.
Mm-hmm.
And I realized later on that the structure I had come up with
Mm-hmm.
was Cicero's 6-part persuasive speech. And I realized Cicero got it from me.
I knew that was coming. I should have even laughed.
Yeah, right. No, but I mean, no, it's,
if you could lend me your time machine later, I'd appreciate it.
Okay. But, I mean, you state the issue, you give the set of facts, you state your argument, you say what the opposite arguments are and refute them, and then you have a conclusion. I mean, it's not real complicated, but a lot of people don't think of that.
I mean, here's the truth of there's nothing new under the sun.
Right.
And if Martin had only learned from the masters when he was young, he wouldn't have had to try to come up with something. That's why the tradition's important. It's already there.
Mm-hmm. And
right?
this
so you're saying Cicero would have been fine without me, is what you're saying.
Cicero would have been fine without you. You would have been better off.
Okay.
You would have been more effective. You wouldn't have had to do the trial and error of figuring out how you were going to put that together if you had learned that structure from the get-go.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. When did you find it, Martin?
What, the Cicero's thing?
Yeah.
I don't remember. But it was after I wrote my original text, because it was a later edition. I put
we added it.
Cicero speech in. But again, it's because that's not what Aristotle's doing. He's having you think deeply and philosophically about the persuasive process, and how it works.
Mm-hmm.
And so really when Dr. Hankins talks about eloquence, there's some more things involved. That's the superstructure, but there's other things you need to do to, and there's different kinds. I mean, Cicero's 6-part persuasion is not the only kind that there can be. I mean, there's all kinds of different speeches. And I use, in my book, other speeches as representative of the 3 major kinds of speeches based on basically his 3-part breakdown. There are forensic, sort of legal type of speeches. There are political type of speeches, and there are ceremonial kinds of speeches. And so they have to be done differently.
Kind of different genres.
They're different genres. Yeah. And so, so for a ceremonial speech, for example, the Gettysburg Address. Gettysburg Address is a really great speech. It's just this 3-paragraph thing. And he's doing a separate thing in each. If you start looking at it and analyzing it, it is so brilliant because it's very short, and yet when you're inside the paragraph, it seems cavernous. He's talking as if he has all the time in the world, and he's doing this in 3 paragraphs. And it's always reminded me of one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world was the statue of Zeus at Halicarnassus, which was in a building, and his head almost touched the roof, which made it look even bigger than it really was, right? That's exactly what Lincoln does in that speech. He makes it sound as if he's got all the time in the world, and yet it's just this short little thing. And the first paragraph is about the past, and the second paragraph is about the present, and the third paragraph is about the future. It's extremely structured if you think, dwell on it a while. But we do that with some other speeches as well that are representative of the political and the legal. So,
yeah, that reminds me. It almost reminds me too of our composition program, just the pro gym. Like repeating the structure over and over, and then you can be free.
Yeah, that's right. And what's the relationship between the pro gym and Aristotle's rhetoric? Really the pro gym is the practical writing of a speech. That's the better focus if you're looking for a practice, but it's still, and you need to be doing that even before you look at the theory, really, just because of the way, the human mind develops from childhood to adult. You need to be doing some things when you're a child, and you can use that time to be doing that, and then later on take account of Aristotle's principles. Right.
But the pro gym also still gives you a structure.
Yes.
Right. And that's I remember being asked to get up and give, just talks, basically to just familiarize myself with getting up and talking in front of people when I was a kid. But I didn't really have a structure with which to work. And so, kids need those opportunities. They need the opportunity to get up and say something in front of some people, but we ask our students, this was something that we added to our conference this year, where we had students that had memorized Horatius or, different memory work, get up and recite that in front of, they did it at Sodalitas in front of 200 people or whatever. They did it at teacher training in front of like 600 people. And just the experience of doing that, they didn't have to come up with anything. They didn't have to say anything spontaneous. But the experience of getting up and saying something is practicing towards that. So kids need that opportunity, but giving them some sort of structure, whether it's a memorized piece of work, whether it's something that they write, but giving them a structure through the program of like, write something about this and then get up and recite that. Work on your ums and your uhs, work on your the way you hold your body. All of those things would be a part of eloquence that Martin doesn't cover in his rhetoric book.
I was going to say, what
but I do. I speak all the time. That's the other thing, is I speak all the time. And I'm thinking, I practice it. And, one thing's just comfort level of standing in front of a bunch of people and saying something. But for example, I get very, the presentation is very different depending on what the situation
Context.
is. Yeah, like for the Memoria Press conference, I always, in my plenary, several hundred people, I always do it from a text because it makes me really, that one of all the speeches, I don't know why, I can speak out and it doesn't make me nervous. Speaking here at our conference is the most nerve-wracking thing of all. And I don't know why, but I feel like it's just high stakes, right? So I make sure that I have a printed speech in front of me and I've written it to be read. That's just an article. And you just write it like an article that somebody's going to read. That's not what you need for a spoken text.
Right.
You need to read it. And this is why imagination is so important. And this is why when I speak somewhere, I go there first and I scope it out. I need to be able to imagine in my head speaking in that place to these people. And then as I'm writing my speech, I have that in mind. So it turns out right. So, and I try to read it in you can read a speech in an animated way, right? But then other speeches,
which is a skill in and of itself.
Yes,
you have to be very good and adept at decoding the words on the page. You have to be able to look up at the audience while having, an understanding of what the next line or two are going to be, while making it flow,
looking up a lot,
bringing your passion into it. That is a skill that really students should work on, is having something in front of them and reading it in a way that it brings up emotions in the audience.
And it just takes practice and a lot of sometimes brutal critique, like your verbalized pauses, like you mentioned, or things you don't even know that you do because you're nervous or whatever, and someone can point out to you. But
then there's other situations. Like I gave a speech at a conference last week, and that one I still didn't. The day began, and I still didn't know exactly what I was going to say because I will force myself to write a new speech by just telling somebody that I will give it. And then, I got to come up with something. So here we go. And so by the first of the day, I still did not have this thing down at all. So I finally decided the 7 principles of classical pedagogy. So that's topical. That's a different kind of structure, right? Because everything's equal. And so I wrote out each thing, right? And I had several examples or anecdotes. And the other thing is anecdotes are so important because people like a story. You need some stories. Was it Mouse Soup, the children's book? The mouse tells the weasel that he's going to run off because the soup that the weasel is making of the mouse. He says, you need some stories in here. This is not going to taste good. Speeches don't taste good unless you put stories in there.
And that's why the program starts with fable and narrative.
That's exactly right.
That's how we learn.
Yes, exactly right. And so got to have a few anecdotes in there. You just write the reference to the anecdote, which I'll go back to later, a year later, and go, what was that a reference to? But,
right.
Yeah. But then I just, and it was very well received. So, and this is just, speaking, there are different kinds of speeches you need to be able to give to different kinds of audiences. And so you got to kind of learn how to do that.
What did you not include in our classical rhetoric set, and why? Because it sounds like you might not have included a chapter, I looked through it, on super practical things.
Well, yeah, because it's theory. You know, so I like how to structure a speech, and that's not really what he's talking about. Mm-hmm. He's talking about the different kinds of speeches, but those can be given in different ways, and those are all parsed out in other texts.
Mm-hmm. Well, and what we do at Memoria a lot of is choosing a classical text and letting that text speak for itself. So Aristotle didn't do much practical, and Martin's just like, let's help the student get through this work on Aristotle. But I think we're also trying to say that there are things through the classical composition program that you're going to work on some practical things, but also just getting children up in front of people that you do have to do to give somebody a full training in rhetoric. It's not just study this one book and you're done.
Yeah, because he's taught, and he's got things sprinkled out throughout the thing, like the 4 forms of government. Why would that be important to a speaker? Well, it kind of depends on if you're a kingship or an aristocracy or an oligarchy, or that's going to be different from a democracy.
Right. Okay? And when you get up to do a political speech, knowing your context is important. Right.
Yeah. He's got a diagram. I diagrammed it, but it's just waiting to be diagrammed. In the book, the 4 reasons people do things, or excuse me, the 7 reasons people do things. Okay.
There are 7?
There are 7, no more and no less.
Really?
Yes.
I would have thought it would be less.
No.
Really?
And there, I think habit.
Go for it.
Dig that out of there.
Yeah, I would love to.
But 3 of them are, and this is in legal speech. Why would you need to know that? The reasons people do things. If you're a lawyer, say, well, 3 of the reasons are involuntary. You couldn't help them. Compulsion was one of them. Whereas 4 of them are voluntary. You chose there. Well, why is that important in law? Well, if you're a lawyer and your client is being accused of doing something, he's only guilty if the action was voluntary. So you try to move the voluntary thing over into the involuntary category, and then he can't be found guilty. It's things like that you wouldn't think of. But yeah, what is
I found it, but it's all blank.
It's only the answer key, and so there's the blanks to fill in.
What a test!
Wonderful. I won't remember what they all are, but I mean that's just a brilliant thing. I've never seen it discussed anywhere. Like you tried it on the internet. I think I tried it on the internet, and I get my article. And
the thing is, I mean, any attorney should be trained in that.
Absolutely.
Right? Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this is why, for example, when alcoholism got recategorized as a disease, is a disease voluntary?
Nope.
So that now makes a difference here. There's other things that we maybe once considered voluntary but we always, when there's like a scandal, they'll say, well, I have a thus and such addiction. Well, what did they just do? They took the voluntary thing and they pushed it over into the involuntary, and they relieved themselves of responsibility because of that. Right? Yeah.
Paul, can we revisit the eloquence conversation?
Sure.
You mentioned James Hankins' quote. Can you tell us the quote again and why that stuck out to you?
Well, he just said that we ought to be teaching eloquence, and he said he preferred the term eloquence than rhetoric because people, and this is actually a very rhetorical argument that he's using, is that because when people hear the word rhetoric, it's not that they're perceiving the logical argument here and getting turned off by it, but there is an affection sort of reaction where they're saying, I've often heard rhetoric used in the sense of empty rhetoric, and I've seen lots of empty rhetoric, and so I don't want to teach my kid that. There's no reason to learn that. Whereas eloquence sounds elevated. It sounds like something that is positive, that is virtuous, that is something to be esteemed. And we're really talking about the same thing. We're talking about persuasion.
Right.
We're talking about verbal persuasion, whether it's written or oral. And, but eloquence does seem to lean more on the let's make it beautiful side, which would lean more to the pathos that Martin's talking about, as opposed to the ethos or the pathos. But I think that's just a connotation. I think we're both driving towards the same thing. We need to teach our children how to be persuasive. But he was just saying, if you call it eloquence, more people might be willing to say, yeah, I need to learn that. He's also coming from a university setting where people choose what they want to take. We don't give our students choices. No. This is part of your core classes. You're taking this, whether it's called rhetoric or eloquence, we don't care. But what really stuck out to me is because since I started working at Memoria, I've sold Martin's rhetoric text, his guide. But I've always told people, don't expect this to get your child up on a soapbox and start talking. You need to be doing that too. Right. And books and text will only take you so far. But if one thing our listeners could hear is they take this, have them use the theory to write papers and have them memorize that paper or become so familiar with it that they could, and get them in front of a group of 10, 20 people. I think Carrie McGraw, maybe she was on the podcast. She mentioned about doing that with getting grandma and grandpa and aunts and uncles to come over, and they'd have like a closing school thing for their homeschool where her kids would get up and do that sort of thing. And in some ways getting up in front of your family is easier. In some ways it's harder. And
definitely harder.
I have totally banned my wife from coming to any of my talks. She's not allowed.
Really?
Oh yeah, no, she knows this.
Really?
If we go travel to a homeschool convention together, I said, you cannot come in that room because it would just messes with me. And I'm like, you can listen to them all day long, like the recordings, whatever, you can listen to that. I don't care. But when I'm actually giving it, when I could look up and see you, it's going to throw me completely off. Whereas if I'm talking to people that I know reasonably, but my wife, I just can't do it. And
with Martin's in there,
I don't care about Martin, but Andrew Pudawa did that to me. He came in my talk at Sonalitas, and like the whole time I was talking about grammar, and I've got Andrew Pudawa in my room, and I'm sitting there going, Andrew, what are you doing here? He likes to hear me talk. I know he does. It's fine, but I'm like, that's not really what I need right now. And so, but I'm used enough to it.
Yeah.
It's my wife respects my wishes more than Andrew does, I guess. But just getting students this opportunity to get up and talk.
Well, and this is the thing, is that you can teach eloquence, right? But if you don't do it and you don't practice,
that's right.
Because really the only way you're going to learn how to speak is to do it. And this is helpful, and other programs that go beyond this are helpful, but they're not sufficient.
It's the structure.
Well, yeah, that's the structure, and you need to have a structure. But there's just something about the practice of it.
In seminary, we had a preaching class, and I think it was like, it was maybe once or twice a week in every class. You might get 3 guys up there that would give a 10-minute thing. And where it was an introduction to but everybody sat in that class and had a rubric where you graded the person. And then afterwards we would all talk about, okay, here's what you did right. Here's what you did wrong. Because as you said, it's, you've got to be brutally honest because we don't, as the speaker, you don't know how the audience is feeling. But that is a hard thing about teaching online, actually, is that if you're not able to see all of your students as you're talking, it's so much easier to teach to a room when we talk about teaching as persuasion, where I had 30 captive kids in 2 different sections all year long, but as I'm talking, if I decide to go off on a tangent, I can see whether their eyes light up because they're like, oh, this is something interesting now. And once I see their eyes light up, it's okay, great. We can go back to the material at hand. But if you don't get that, because we have nonverbals, but you still don't fully know what the student's thinking. And it's really interesting. I keep a distance between my students, right? You gotta have some sort of professional distance. But then like after the class is over and I've talked to some students now, and like they know their grade doesn't depend on what they say to me, sort of thing. And then some truth starts to come out, and I was like, oh, that would have been really helpful to know halfway through the year. I had one student that saw me in an informal setting, and I was wearing, something completely outside of formal professional dress code. And he was like, if I saw you wearing that as before you taught me, I would not have respected you at all. It's the small things, right?
Yeah.
And so the kind of knowing what your bounds are, right? And so you're going to give a very different speech to your family than you're going to give.
Well, the other
to
thing
people you
too
don't know.
is, which is really important in speaking, is eye contact. And I do this automatically. I'm sure they probably tell people to do this, but you automatically as a speaker, you will identify 4, 5, 6 people, and you will repeatedly look at them and them only. And so every once in a while, your eyes will sweep, but because they're the ones looking at you. So you're going to make eye contact here, and you're going to say something, you're going to make eye contact there, and you're going to do this sort of thing. And you're talking about teaching online. This is a problem with teaching online, is that you're looking screen. You may be looking at the student, and the student's looking at you, but neither one of you knows you're looking. I mean, well, they know that you know that they're looking at you because you're the only one on the screen for them. But when you're looking at 12 students on the screen, none of them knows that you're looking at them.
Right. And
you're looking at the screen, not actually at the camera.
Right.
Yeah.
And when you're talking to someone in person, you mentioned their body language, but you can even change. If you know your talk well enough, you can modify as you see either boredom or excitement. Yeah. And you can really,
I'm gonna skip that story. I'm gonna elongate that story. I'm gonna hammer this point a little bit longer
because you're feeling a certain thing from your audience. Yeah, that feedback.
Yeah, but that means you just have to be a master of what you're saying, right? So content is hugely important. That you can't get up there with sort of a half-baked thought, because to really be a master at it, you have to be able to do those sorts of things on the fly, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I just watched Ronald Reagan after his assassination attempt, like a week later, he was given a month later, and a balloon popped. And he just said, "Miss me," and he kept going, right? And I mean, but that meant he was such a master of what he was saying that he had the mental capacity to keep going and to ad lib and come back.
And he would use index cards with notes. So he was not, unless it was later on when the teleprompters come in and he's giving a State of the Union speech, because he was a master speaker. But usually, he went around the country for decades speaking at civic groups and this sort of thing. Kiwanis and the Rotary clubs and all this stuff, which were I don't even know that they're even operating, many of them anymore, but that was the heyday of them. And so he would go around speaking to them, and he used index cards, which were just notes. They were just to prompt something. He says, so he already had it in his mind. His index cards were simply there to cue him to say something. And if you do that, you do have to master your content. And that's something that no program, because the fatal temptation in education is to come up with a process, a method to do everything. And there are methods, and they are helpful, but they're not sufficient. You have to have content, and you have to have a fund of anecdotes and stories. And that's stuff that you can't really be given except through your own experience in life and your own reading about other people's experiences in life. That's where you get those things. And sometimes you think of those, you're going through a speech, it may even be a written speech, and you think of the anecdote just comes to you at that moment, and you do a little diversion, and then you go back to the text or whatever. But yeah, content is the undervalued aspect of speaking.
And doing it well is such an art. It's so beautiful. It's
telling, and that's the other thing, is that telling a story is not easy. That's something you have to practice. Some people do not know how to tell a good story.
Right, because they start at the end, or they start halfway in the middle, and you're like, where did the beginning? What happened in the beginning?
You need to even in an anecdote, there's a little conflict going on there. You have to increase the conflict so when people wonder, oh, what now? Boom. Yeah. And you give it to them. And again, that's and Rod Dreher once said to me that, because he's from Louisiana, and he moved to New York or Boston, I think, to be a journalist. And he was a reporter, and he said, I hung out with all of these city people. He said, nobody knew how to tell a story. He said, me and this other reporter who was also from the South, we're the only ones who could tell stories. Because they came from a rural environment, they were around real things, not so many abstractions, and so that, it's actually certain people can't tell stories, and some of that has to do with where you came from.
Right. And things to talk about, you talk about being in a rural environment, but it's funny because as I grew up, I realized like my dad had a whole network of people from his work that knew me and knew what I was doing, and I didn't know them. And then you like walk into dad's office and you're like, and they're like, oh, how's, whatever you're studying. And I'm like, how do you I don't even know who you are. Right. But that's what dad would talk about, was he would talk about his kids. Right. But, and that's really what he had to talk about. But then as his agricultural pursuits increased, then I realized now his clients start hearing about that all the time. Right. And I realized, when I started working at Memoria, all I had to talk about was education. And then as I started the farm, now I have people coming up to me and they want to know about the farm because there's something other that they don't ever get to experience, but they know like, I'm going to have a story from that week. Right. And, or that day. And I just have so many more stories to tell. And now when I have neighbors come over and Sarah's like, he's going to be here for like 3 hours. I'm like, yes, I do. I do know that. But we're both going to be telling stories late into the night because that's just what we do. We have so many stories to tell because it's not just, what happened in your office. I come home and Sarah's like, what fun happened in your office today? I was like, some days I have something, but most days I don't. And then, but I'm considered like, what happened on the farm, and we can talk and talk about that. And so just having something to talk about. But when I lived in town, it was go to work, go home, sit at home, read, watch TV, whatever it was. Maybe if I was lucky, I could mow my lawn if Sarah didn't beat me to it. And then,
well, the other thing too is, and it's sort of sideways related to storytelling, is having common references. Okay, this is part of a big problem now because everyone is in their own little trench now. And so you don't have the same set of references. And this is one of the reasons why, and if you go back and you look at older literature, everybody had the same set of references. Because everybody got the same kind of education. It was basically
but it used
classical.
To be, and there wasn't a whole massive inventory of books.
Right.
So it used to be books and then it became movies. But now
it's just content.
The rate at which we're pushing this stuff out. And I mean, I've been on the internet for a few years, but like we now have coworkers. And I'm like, what in the world are you talking about? And like, oh, you don't remember this like internet fad that lasted 3 weeks, like 4 years ago? No, I missed that.
Because everybody used to watch the same thing. I mean, there's nobody in my era who hadn't watched Gilligan's Island. And I actually have a Gilligan's Island reference in one of my speeches. And I may have to take it. Yeah. And I may have to take it out because how long is that going to be good?
Getting irrelevant.
Huh?
It's getting irrelevant.
It's getting, they don't know what that means. They don't know who Gilligan was. So, I mean, that's another problem with speaking anymore, is you have to have some idea of how many of your references the audience is going to even get.
And then it makes bringing in those stories or those references even harder because you have to spend a long time explaining like this is why this is important. Whereas if it's common cultural knowledge, it can be literally a half a sentence that brings all of that into their minds.
That's right. It draws on. Yeah. It's really interesting ending on the note of human connection when we talk about eloquence and rhetoric, because these structural things are critical to doing it well. But the goal in using them is always to connect with what's in front of you for whatever goal it is. So you mentioned like the courtroom or politics or persuading someone to maybe donate to a fund or just believe what you're saying. It's the connection part.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Well, thanks, Paul and Martin, for joining us today, letting us talk through your works, Martin.
What better thing could we talk about, really?
You could say that. Oh, and thank you for joining us as well. We will be back next time. Thanks for joining us today on Classical, Etc. by Memoria Press. If you like what you heard, please like, subscribe, or share this episode or comment. We love to hear your questions and your comments. If you want to learn more about Memoria Press, please go to memoriapress.com. This has been Classical, Etc. We're so glad you joined us, and we'll see you next time.